I want to welcome everyone here to the Foundation for Defense of Democracies' one-year anniversary conversation marking 12 months since the Iran deal was agreed on in Vienna this week. And I'm thinking back to having spent 18 days in a row in Vienna there myself last year, and some of you might have also been there. And this last year has given us a chance to kind of, with the benefit of distance and time, look at the implementation of that deal. As many of you know, it took about 6 months to get the deal off the ground, to get it implemented, with the simultaneous taking of actions by Iran to limit their nuclear activities, and the simultaneous lifting by the U.S. and the European Union of a number of sanctions that had crippled Iran's economy across a variety of sectors, including the financial sector and oil, but not limited to those, over the last several years. As many of you know, it was only supposedly nuclear-related sanctions that were to be lifted, that other sanctions remain in place. But this panel is going to be focused on, in the 6 months since the deal was implemented in January, what steps have been taken on an economic front by Iran to try to legitimize its business dealings, to try to get the maximum economic benefit that it can out of the deal. And you'll all remember that a year ago, the P5+1 leaders from the UN Security Council said that the deal had to be a compromise on both sides, that in exchange for taking these steps to limit its nuclear activities, Iran had to get some economic benefit to give it the incentive to continue to comply with the deal. So a lot has happened in the last 6 months. There is supposedly a leaked copy of UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's report on compliance with the first 6 months of the deal. It's been reported by Reuters. It hasn't been confirmed, but we could certainly talk about that. We can talk about actions that have been taken by the United States government in an effort to make sure that the U.S. complies with the deal, and efforts by Iran to try to press the United States to do more. And for those of you who haven't been following it so closely, from a U.S. point of view, the biggest deal has probably been this estimated $25 billion planned sale by Boeing of civilian aircraft to Iran Air for what are meant to be civilian planes. And on Thursday night, the House, by a voice vote, passed a number of amendments that would seek to block this deal, even though it's allowed for under the Iran Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, as the official name of the Iran deal is. So we have two excellent speakers here who really have studied this issue up and down for years and years and years. And I want to give you the chance to hear from them on this very important issue of where we are economically a year since the deal was signed. Sitting at my left, Mark Dubowitz is the Executive Director of Foundation for Defense of Democracies and of its Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance. He's a lawyer. He's a sanctions expert. He leads projects on Iran, sanctions, nonproliferation, and he has advised both the administration and Congress on a number of sanctions over the last 6 years or more. And sitting to my right is Eric Lorber, who's a senior advisor to FDD's Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance, and he is himself a former Treasury Department official. He's also a senior associate at the Financial Integrity Network, which advises clients on issues related to economic sanctions and regulatory compliance. So, Mark, I want to start out with you by asking you to lay out for us the sort of numbers of how Iran has gained financially from the Iran deal and its level of economic engagement with the international community. Maybe you could start out by telling us what's happened to oil sales and if anything else has happened beyond oil sales to help Iran.
Great. Well, thank you, Indira, and thank you to Eric, and thank you to all of you for showing up. So I think when we talk about Iran and economic relief, it's worth remembering that from an Iranian perspective, the JCPOA was not the end of the negotiations, but it was very much the beginning of the negotiations. And we're seeing the Iranians continuing to press, making the claim that they haven't gotten enough economic relief. When we talk about economic relief, we sometimes get caught up in sort of the numbers in terms of oil sales and foreign direct investment and some of the deals that are being signed, like the Boeing deal. But it's worth stepping back and looking at something that's kind of boring, but it's kind of important, which is the macroeconomic situation in Iran, based on the familiar indicators that all economies look at: GDP, growth, inflation, the exchange rate, foreign exchange earnings, etc. And it's also worth remembering in 2013 that Iran was about 4 to 6 months away from a severe balance of payments crisis, where it effectively was running out of foreign exchange reserves and was pretty close to a almost, I wouldn't say quite, but an almost Venezuela-style economic collapse. That was sort of 2013. And as a result of a number of decisions made, including by the administration, to block new sanctions, to enter a negotiation process with Iran over the interim agreement, giving Iran $11.9 billion in returned escrowed oil funds over the negotiation period, putting a cap on the oil sales, and basically allowing Iran to sell at the level that it had been selling at, relieving sanctions on the auto sector, petrochemical sector. You actually saw quite a significant economic recovery from that point in time, right? From a very severe recession to a modest recovery by 2014, 2015. And now looking 2016, 2017, this is an Iranian economy projected to grow about 3.5%. Inflation has gone from, unofficially, it was about 80%, and it's now down to single digits. The exchange rate, which had plummeted about 70%, has now stabilized. And Iran is, by no stretch of the imagination, in good economic shape, but it is certainly has avoided the kind of severe economic collapse that it was facing. So the Iranians have done fairly well. Now, when I say the Iranians, let me be very clear. The Iranian people have not done very well. The Revolutionary Guard has actually made off like the bandits they are. And they are signing the major multi-billion-dollar deals. They're the ones that are actually getting the lion's share of the economic relief today. So the Revolutionary Guards and the Supreme Leader himself, who owns a $95 billion holding company that also got delisted as part of the JCPOA, they're in a very good position today, having negotiated some very economically advantageous deals. But I would just conclude with this: keep your eye on the macroeconomic indicators as you see Iran's economy over the next few years begin to improve step by step.
Mark, you bring up the point of the improvements in the macroeconomy. Of course, what the Obama administration tells us is that the oil sales by Iran dropped precipitously after the mid-2012 oil sanctions, secondary and tertiary sanctions imposed by the United States, and the primary oil embargo imposed by the European Union. And their oil sales went down from about 2.5 million barrels a day to 1.1 million barrels a day. I understand, Eric, from the numbers I've looked at, of Iran's sales, that they're actually now back up to pre-sanction levels of both oil production and oil sales, but that in areas beyond the petrochemical sector, they have not managed to reap the rewards that they were hoping they would get, at least initially, from the deal. So tell us a little bit, tell us a little bit about your perspective on why they haven't gotten the benefits they thought they would.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Indira, and thank you to Mark and FTD for hosting us for this important discussion. I think the short answer is that the sticking point has largely been Iran's access or lack thereof to the international financial sector. You've seen since the signing of the JCPOA, and in particular since the implementation day, there's been a lot of interest from manufacturing companies, from service companies to provide goods and services to Iran. But the one thing that they're not able to really find is banking for these services. And so if you look at the Wolfsburg Group banks, so the largest, basically 11 banks in the world, the global banks, the vast majority of these are completely unwilling to go back into Iran as a jurisdiction because of the risks that remain in the country. So it's not just risks related to, for example, as Mark was pointing out, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is well known to engage in material support for terrorism, illicit finance, money laundering, etc. But there are also sanctions risks that remain in the country. So it's been a partial unwinding of the sanctions on Iran, right? So most U.S. primary sanctions remain in place, but most European sanctions have been lifted. There are kind of two complications, and this is particularly troubling for the financial sector. One is that the reach of U.S. primary sanctions is actually incredibly broad. So, for example, if I'm a German bank and I want to bank business in Iran, and I have a U.S. citizen who is a chief compliance officer or on the board of that bank, and that U.S. citizen approves those financing deals, all of a sudden the entire bank and the entire transaction is subject to U.S. primary sanctions jurisdiction and is prohibited. The takeaway from this is that in a globalized economy and a globalized supply chain system, you can almost always find some U.S. nexus that's sufficient for the imposition of remaining primary U.S. sanctions. The other important point.
Can I just interrupt for a second? Because that is fascinating. I had not heard that before. Does that mean that the compliance officer is actually forbidden from signing off on the deal?
So that's right. In fact, what we recommend in my private practice to banks and other institutions that are dealing with this is that there be, in effect, a complete firewall between U.S. persons and any Iran-related activity. So if, for example, I'm in Frankfurt and I'm a U.S. person, I'm an American citizen, and I see a deal like that come across my table, instead of looking at it and passing it on to somebody else, I simply have to say, I can't do this. Please, someone else look at this deal. Non-U.S. citizen, look at this deal. And so you'll get basically what are in effect recusal, very, very sophisticated recusal policies to make sure that there is no U.S. nexus in these transactions. And the second concern beyond this primary U.S. sanctions jurisdiction is that secondary sanctions still actually apply and remain on Iran. So everyone hears that, the phrase, oh, well, U.S. secondary sanctions were lifted as part of the deal. Generally, that's true, but a number of core ones still remain in place. And the really core one, which relates to the financial sector, is if you are a foreign financial institution, a German bank, for example, and you do business with the IRGC, you can be cut off from U.S. financial markets. It's very simple. If you're an international bank, getting cut off from U.S. financial markets is essentially a death knell because you don't get access, for the most part, to U.S. dollars. And 85% of world trade, cross-border trade, is done in USD. It's denominated, in USD. So these banks are looking at this situation, and not only are they seeing the illicit finance and the money laundering and other activities in Iran itself, but they're also seeing that the patchwork of sanctions that remain on the country are very, very powerful and, frankly, are risk prohibited for most of these banks considering re-entering the Iranian market.
So when you say that if you're a German bank, for example, and you engage in some transaction with the IRGC, but the IRGC, if I understand, has not been sanctioned in the same way that the Quds Force, for example, has been. But is it still that any company that is controlled by the IRGC and that reaches widely across the Iranian economy, that you would still be subject to sanctions, even though the IRGC is not subject to the same kinds of sanctions as Quds Force and either one of you?
Well, the IRGC is still sanctioned under U.S. law. They're sanctioned for a number of reasons, including missile proliferation, human rights, for their activities in Syria. The IRGC hasn't been designated as a terrorist organization. The Quds Force has, but the IRGC itself in its entirety hasn't been designated as a terrorist organization under what is called Executive Order 13224 or as a foreign terrorist organization. But still, significant risks in doing business with the IRGC. And in fact, European IRGC sanctions also remain in place. So both the Europeans and the Americans have strict IRGC sanctions, which are obviously very difficult when you think of every key strategic of the sector of the Iranian economy that international investors care about has a heavy IRGC penetration and preponderance.
Yeah. Can I also weigh in on that too? It's not just the IRGC, that you have to worry about, and I apologize because I'm getting a little bit into the legalese of this. It's also the agents and affiliates of the IRGC that are prohibited persons. So we got into this conversation on last Thursday when Mark and I were testifying before House Financial Services. But if, for example, Iran Air, if a U.S. company does business with Iran Air could be construed as an agent or affiliate of the IRGC, and therefore those transactions very well may be prohibited under U.S. law.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, because I think we're going to talk about the Boeing deal, but it's sort of an interesting segue here. Iran Air itself had been listed because it had been used by the IRGC for missile proliferation and moving militants and money and arms to the Assad government and to Lebanese Hezbollah. It was delisted in 2016 as part of the implementation of the JCPOA. The problem, of course, is that it should never have been delisted because it was not a nuclear sanction. It was a sanction that had everything had to do with the Revolutionary Guards and missiles and terrorism. And so this Boeing deal and the Airbus deal are being done with Iran Air, which is an entity previously listed for all of this illicit behavior, and which continues to fly these flights from a resupply base in Abadan, Iran, to Syria, using false transponders, and it's hiding its flight pathways. So there's every reason to believe that if you're Boeing and you're going in and trying to deal with Iran Air, it is a due diligence nightmare to try and figure out whether Iran Air is still itself conducting illicit flights, or Iran Air is actually going to be in a position to supply your planes to Mahan Air and 3 other sanctioned Iranian aircraft that are still sanctioned because they're supporting the IRGC. So this is just giving you a sort of small snapshot of the kind of risks that exist for U.S. and for international companies in doing business in IRGC-dominated sectors.
I want to get back to the Boeing deal because it's something I think everyone in this room cares about. But before we drill down onto that, Eric, I want you to give us a little bit more of the 30,000-foot view of the sort of what you just are describing. It sounds like a compliance headache. I'm not going to use the word nightmare. It's for you to decide. But it sounds like it certainly is challenging for international banks and businesses. So I guess my question is, when Iran complains that it's not getting the benefit that it had expected out of the Iran deal, whose fault is that? Is that because of could Iran be doing things differently to make it easier for banks and businesses to do business with them and comply with remaining sanctions and law?
I do think that Iran could be doing things to make it significantly easier. The reason that banks are not willing to go back into the country, to a certain extent, it's the sanctions-related risk. But if the Iranian economy and the Iranian financial sector were more transparent, if the IRGC, for example, hadn't spent the past 10 years developing sanctions evasion techniques, which include, to a large extent, building front companies, building shell corporations and things like that, which make it very difficult from a banking perspective to do due diligence and to properly understand who your counterparty is and who you're actually banking and doing business with, then if the Iranians had done that, I don't think there would be such significant reluctance on the part of major Western banks to go back in. As it is, the only banks you're really seeing entertain re-entering Iranian financial markets and banking Iranian deals are smaller European banks, a couple Austrian banks, a couple German banks. I've seen some Italian banks that have very limited exposure to the United States. So those banks are basically entertaining the risk calculus that even if we run afoul of U.S. regulations, we're not really exposed to the U.S., so it's probably not going to be that much of a problem for us. But again, the larger banks, if you actually look at their internal policies, across the board, Iran is basically what's considered a no-go zone.
Okay. So, Mark, when the administration says, and now I'm talking about the Obama administration, says that Iran is trying to do things to improve its behavior with, for example, the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, or with the IMF to improve its transparency or compliance, what do you say to that?
Well, I think it's a premature assessment. I mean, the Financial Action Task Force still kept Iran on its blacklist. It temporarily suspended for 1 year the mandatory application of countermeasures, but then it followed up with very stark and clear warnings about Iran's continued illicit financial activities. Iran also, with respect to, we're talking about Financial Action Task Force compliance, I mean, one of the things that you have to do when you get off the blacklist and you agree to an action plan is you have to agree not to engage in terror financing. Well, unfortunately, Iran defines terrorism very differently than the rest of the world, and explicitly includes, organizations that are fighting occupation or are trying to defend their national rights, and they've got this whole long, convoluted definition of terrorism, which I think most FATF members don't subscribe to. So you've got a situation today where my fear is that I think the administration is so desperate to lock in the deal and to ensure that Iran gets all of the economic benefits that Iran wants, that they are falling susceptible to a legitimization campaign that the Iranians are running. And I'd say quite successfully. I mean, the Iranians ran a very, very successful nuclear legitimization campaign, right? They got all of these benefits. They gave up only part of their nuclear program, and they never admitted to past wrongdoing to a long decades-long rap sheet of nuclear mendacity, I think Iran has realized they can follow the same strategy on the financial side, which is deny, deceive, don't disclose, and continue to pressure the administration in its waning months to agree to some fundamental changes that would very much lock in this deal, and I think would create enormous difficulties for the next president. Chief among them, I'm sure, Indira, we were going to talk about this, but chief among them is giving Iran access to the U.S. dollar through dollarized transactions. If Iran gets that, which was a concession that they forgot to negotiate during the JCPOA, or maybe they tried to negotiate, but the Treasury Department refused that concession. If they get that concession, it's going to be exceedingly difficult for a President Clinton or President Trump to use non-nuclear sanctions, particularly financial sanctions, to push back against Iran's malign behavior. So you've really got in the next 6 months a sort of race against the clock by both the Iranians and by the Obama administration to give as many concessions as possible, including those not negotiated as part of the JCPOA, in order to lock in the deal. And I'm afraid that if they do that, they're going to paralyze U.S.-Iran policy for the next administration.
All right, I want to circle back and talk a little bit more about the dollarization, but just following directly on what you said, we have a question that someone from our audience sent in ahead of time that follows right on what Mark was talking about, and maybe, Eric, you can address it. The person wants to know, what could the Iranian government do in a relatively short span of time, say 6 months to a year, to provide it a good case for eliminating further sanctions? Or are we in a situation where Iran's behavior must be modified over a more extended period of time to justify any further removal of sanctions?
I mean, I think that Iran is going to have a very difficult time in the next 6 months, short of completely casting off any aspirations for supporting any material support for Hezbollah, any material support for other terrorist organizations that it's historically assisted, to actually make a significant, to make the international financial community in particular, but also more generally the United States and its Western partners, change their perspective on what Iran's activities are and whether or not it remains a very high-risk jurisdiction to do business in, or that sanctions should remain in place. So I think what you're looking at here is a much longer-term perspective. I don't think the Iranians can do anything in the short term to basically create a situation where there'll be a wholesale lifting of the remaining sanctions on the Islamic Republic. I think what you're going to see, and I think this is exactly Mark's point, and I think it's right, is that the Iranians are going to continue to kind of, I'm very bad with analogies, but what's the one where the camel's nose under the tent? They're going to keep trying to push a little bit here and a little bit here to see how much they can get. And frankly, and I know we will talk about this in a second, but this is the dollarized transaction question, the offshore dollarized transaction question. I don't think that was bargained for in the JCPOA negotiations, but once Iran began saying, well, we haven't gotten the economic relief we were expecting, that this is threatening the validity and the stability of the deal, that's when you saw the administration really step in and almost give them something which seemed like very clearly like a concession, a non-bargain for concession. And that has been the Iranian strategy. It's basically been to figure out ways to sort of move the goalposts ever so slightly in ways that don't really violate the letter or the spirit of the deal, but still get Iran enough such that it benefits in a way that it probably shouldn't have under the original terms of the deal.
And sorry, if I could just quickly add to that, because I think it's part of the 30,000-foot view. I mean, I don't spend a lot of time defending this administration on the Iran deal, but this administration is absolutely correct when they say, we never guaranteed Iran economic outcomes as part of this deal. Right? And when you talk to U.S. negotiators, the Iranians asked for economic outcomes. I mean, what would an economic outcome would look like? It would something to the effect of, we guarantee you that the 12 major international financial institutions will plug back into the Iranian financial system. We guarantee you a GDP growth rate higher than 3.5%. We guarantee you that inflation will fall to single digits. We guarantee you foreign direct investment of more than $50 billion on an annual basis. I mean, those are the kind of economic outcomes or examples of economic outcomes that the Iranians were asking for or could have asked for. The administration said, absolutely not. We're not guaranteeing you economic outcomes. What we are guaranteeing you is that we will lift or suspend hundreds of U.S. sanctions and European sanctions. That's exactly what the administration and its partners did on implementation day. No more and no less. And that's exactly what was bargained for. And so now for Iran to come back and effectively say to the administration, we're just not happy with the economic relief we got, we want you to guarantee economic outcomes, is for Iran to return back to the position of continuing to negotiate points that were supposedly well settled as part of the JCPOA. But let's be frank, that's exactly what's going to happen over the next decade. Iran will continue to renegotiate the JCPOA, relitigate it, find ambiguities, find loopholes, and in violating both the spirit and the letter of the law, which I would argue Iran is doing right now, continue to try and extract greater and greater concessions from the United States.
Well, let's talk to specifically, Mark, about that dollar question. Now, the administration says that they never intended to give U-turn transactions, to permit Iran to be able to use the U.S. financial system to have its transactions transfer through U.S. banks, that they had no intention of doing that. And they claim that that non-U.S. people are already permitted to handle U.S. dollars with respect to Iran. So say if an Indian bank has a stack of U.S. dollars in its vault, that it can pay Iran for its oil with those dollars anyway. So tell us what you believe they were trying to do and what you believe would go against the deal.
So I think that answer from the administration is not wrong, but it's incomplete. And it's incomplete for the following reason. First, the Iranians are absolutely demanding access to the U.S. financial system directly through lifting the prohibition on what is called the U-turn transaction. Right? When a transaction is done, literally that electronic bleep, it actually goes through New York, and it's in a millisecond, but that's called a U-turn transaction. And the Iranians have been demanding access to the U-turn into the U.S. financial system. The administration says they're not going to give Iran that access. What Iran then is asking for is essentially dollarized transactions that take place offshore. So when a transaction is done between a European bank and an Iranian bank in euros and rials, at some point that transaction has to be dollarized, because most foreign currency transactions are at some point converted in the US dollar, right? The US dollar is the most stable currency, it's the most used currency, and it also doesn't fluctuate as much as other currencies do. So for these foreign exchange transactions, many, or if not most of them, are dollarized in that way, and Iran wants access to that dollarized transaction. Now, it's
meaning it would have to come through ultimately from an American financial institution that would be transferring that money offshore.
Well, that's exactly right. Now, there's banks abroad have dollars. I mean, when you travel abroad, you've got dollars in your pocket, right? Those dollars are being used all the time, and they're being used for Iranian transactions even today. But at some point, those dollars have to be replaced. And it's U.S. financial institutions that actually put dollars into the global financial sector and take those dollars back out. So there effectively is a very slow U-turn in the sense that those dollars go in and those dollars go back out. And so what you have today is a situation where even though these banks have dollars, at some point they're going to have to get replacement dollars. And they are very concerned right now, without an explicit license from the U.S. government, that if they use those dollars for an Iranian transactions, they're going to find themselves on the wrong side of an enforcement action, which is why
the administration claims that if you have dollars in your bank, you can do what you want with them if there's no American person involved.
Look, if you're a global financial institution and the administration is claiming that, you're going to ask for an explicit guarantee that if I use those dollars, I'm not going to find, again, myself on the wrong side of an enforcement action. So you're going to want a general license to cover you as a foreign bank, and the U.S. banks who are putting the money in and taking the money out are also going to want to be covered by that general license. And no one's willing to take this risk because this isn't explicitly permitted, as far as I remember, Eric, under U.S. law. There are hints of this, but there's no explicit guarantee. This is an enormous financial risk. Now, I'll just quickly conclude with this, but why does Iran want dollarized transactions beyond the technical nature of the trade that I described? The reason they want the U.S. government to effectively green light the greenback is because that provides the stamp of approval, the legitimacy that Iran is seeking, right? Iran is an illicit financial actor today. They've got a long rap sheet of financial crimes. They're trying to get themselves out from under this enormous risk overhang that is preventing large banks from going back in. If they can get the U.S. government to effectively green light the greenback and say to Iran, yeah, you get to use our currency, the most important reserve and trading and financial currency in the world, Iran can use that as part of its financial legitimization campaign, and that is the nose under the camel's head, as Eric has described it.
Okay, Eric, I think a lot of people are going to want to hear a bit more about the Boeing deal, so we probably shouldn't wait too long to tell them about it. So you were testifying last week, as was Mark, about the Boeing deal. We have one question here from the audience submitted in advance. What are the prospects for Boeing and Airbus consummating their contracts with Iran? Many of you may know that Airbus, the French company, had a big MOU with Iran shortly after implementation day, but we haven't heard much about anything happening yet. I'm told that these aircraft transactions take years and are really complex. It's not something that would happen in a matter of months. But tell us, how would this work, since we're talking about billions and billions of dollars? Would EU and or U.S. banks do the transactions? And what were you telling Congressman last week?
Absolutely. So, as just sort of a brief overview, as part of the JCPOA, there was a statement of specific licensing policy and what's called General License I, which were both bargained for and issued as part of the agreement, which basically say the United States should take a favorable view towards allowing the sale of commercial aircraft for commercial purposes to Iran, to non-designated persons in Iran, in this case, Iran Air. So over the past few months, both Boeing and Airbus have signed MOUs. I think the Airbus MOU was initially valued at $27 billion. The Boeing was, we've heard $25 billion. I think the number for the sale was $18.7 billion, and then leasing for another I think 20 or 30 aircraft. So probably about the same as well. And both Boeing and Airbus have applied for these licenses from the Office of Foreign Asset Control. So in effect, they are waiting.
At the Treasury Department.
At the Treasury Department, right. They are waiting to hear back. And last week, Mark and I were up discussing this because there's real concern, and it's very valid concern, that these aircraft are either going to be used directly by Iran Air, who's the counterparty in these transactions, for potential illicit purposes. I know Mark mentioned earlier that Iran Air was designated in 2011 for engaging in supplying resupply routes for both Hezbollah in Lebanon and for President Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and that it appears there's evidence to suggest that Iran Air is still engaged in this activity, or that if Iran Air is not going to be the ultimate beneficiary, the ultimate receiver of these airplanes, that they'll be subleased to designated parties, like Mahan Air, for example, which is designated under U.S. law.
Can I ask you just a question? If they're selling a passenger airplane, would a commercial passenger airplane be used to do this kind of resupply you're talking about, or would they be using other existing, for example, if during June, as Mark said, they did 3 of these resupply flights for Assad, they're doing it with aircraft that they already have, not with brand spanking new French or American passenger aircraft. How do we know they would be using the same planes if that's indeed... if those planes have been used for purposes.
So that's actually a fantastic question, and that really goes to the heart of what's at issue here, and it's whether you can verify how these new aircraft are going to be used. So, for example, if you can ensure without a shadow of a doubt that they won't be flying routes to, for example, resupply bases in Syria, then most on the Hill, I think, would be more comfortable, though certainly not completely comfortable, with facilitating or at least allowing OFAC to issue the general license. But I don't think that certainty exists. It's useful to keep this in context. As I mentioned before, Iran has spent the past 10 and 15 years developing sophisticated sanctions evasion mechanisms and techniques. And so what they used to do with a lot of these aircraft in Iran Air is they would set a route for 3 months down the line, and then they would, within 3 hours of announcing the route, they would say that it had been completely sold out, and there were actually fictitious passengers, and they would instead load the planes up with arms, munitions, or militants, IRGC individuals, to go and serve on the front. And so I think that there is a very serious risk that even in the case where they are sold to Iran Air, and even in the case where there are certain validation procedures in place to ensure that they're not used for these routes, that the facts on the ground will actually be different, and they will be used for illicit activities.
Yeah, it's worth just adding to that the entire fleet of Iran Air is 36 planes. The combined Airbus-Boeing deal to start is 200 planes. The Iranian minister in charge of this talked about 500 planes. So even if Iran Air doubles its fleet to about 70 planes, you've still got somewhere in the neighborhood of 130 to 430 planes that are going to go somewhere else. Where are they going to go? Well, there are 4 other still sanctioned Iranian airlines. So again, regardless of how those airlines use the planes, they're still sanctioned. So that's the point. It doesn't matter how they use the planes. They're still sanctioned under U.S. law. That sale or transfer or lease of the 130 to 430 aircraft from Iran Air to these other airlines would be a violation of U.S. sanctions. So how do you actually reassure yourself, and how does Boeing and Airbus reassure the U.S. Congress that these aircraft are only going to be used for civilian purposes by a non-sanctioned civilian aircraft company that is not going to be still conducting the same illicit activities that it was conducting only last month? And that's why this deal, again, is a due diligence nightmare for Boeing, for Airbus, and for the banks that bank this deal. And I think that's why it's such a concern. The other thing is, the JCPOA basically says that OFAC is going to set up a licensing regime. It doesn't describe the nature of that licensing regime. So it gives OFAC and legislators a fair amount of flexibility to design a certification regime where aircraft will only be licensed if, for example, if the president can certify that these planes are not going to sanctioned entities. And it would be a big mistake, in my view, which was the thrust of my testimony last week, to basically go on a wing and a prayer. So let's sell the planes and spend $50 billion and put U.S. taxpayers through Exim Bank on the hook for the financing, and then hope and pray that the Iranians don't use this for illicit activity. I think it would be better to actually have a period of time to pass, a certification by the U.S. president, and assurances from Iran over its conduct, not just its verbal assurances that this is not going to take place. And I think that actually is a good lesson for how we should be relaxing these sanctions over time, and not just depending on kind of hope and change in the Iranian regime after decades of financial and nuclear mendacity.
I know that we're going to have to turn to audience questions shortly, but I want to ask you, Mark, even though our focus today is on the economic and financial piece, the administration has said that, they're getting, in their view, they're getting what they wanted out of this deal, which is nuclear compliance, and that immediately on that day in January, Iran's nuclear capabilities and activities were immediately constrained and are being monitored and verified, so they feel like they're winning. So I'd like to hear from you what you think about the compliance aspect when the administration keeps saying, look, whatever you say about Iran and other things they're doing with ballistic missiles or anything else, they are complying with the nuclear aspects of this deal, which was meant to be just a nuclear deal, not to suddenly whitewash them and make them great players. Right. The United States, as we all know, still considers Iran to be the leading state sponsor of terrorism in the world, and that didn't change with the nuclear deal, correct?
Right. So it depends how narrowly you construe this deal, right? If you construe the deal based on specific provisions with respect to giving up its LEU stockpiles, limiting its enrichment to 3%, to warehousing, basically 13,000 centrifuges, to putting concrete in the core of the Iraq heavy water reactor, then Iran is complying with the deal, and the IAEA has certified those very specific elements of it. If you think the deal also involves the implementation resolution of the UN Security Council resolution, right, which is the UN Security Council resolution 2231 that actually implements the deal, and that resolution includes requirements that Iran not engage in the testing of long-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, not be violating any arms embargoes, then we have a very different situation. Iran is clearly violating the implementation resolution. If you also think that the JCPOA prohibits Iran from engaging in illicit procurement of nuclear and missile technology, then you'd be very troubled by what the German intelligence services reported on last week. And that report, which still remains a little unclear, and it'd be interesting to learn a little bit more about it if you're in Congress, but the German intelligence services said that in 2015, the Iranians engaged in illicit procurement on a significant scale for both nuclear and missile technology. That German intelligence report, the federal report, was then backed up by 8 reports that were released by the state intelligence services, which also said the same thing and confirmed a significant number of these illicit procurement cases. You also had certainly a line, which was very interesting to me, in the federal report that says that these activities are likely to continue, meaning into 2016. And then you have the Wall Street Journal quoting two German intelligence services officials who said, well, actually, indeed, it has continued. Well, what has continued? The missile procurement, the nuclear procurement, both? I mean, it's interesting for us to ascertain that. So what you had is a situation that in 2015, right, before the deal was negotiated and after the deal was negotiated, the Iranians were engaged in illicit nuclear and missile procurement technology in Germany. Why? Because they're trying to get their hands on materials so they have a clandestine pathway to a nuclear weapon. Right? They want to get materials to build advanced centrifuges and to put in place an advanced enrichment program that is hidden from the eyes of the IAEA. That should be deeply troubling to everybody, and it should demand a significant investigation by the U.S. Congress and by the administration. And if these activities continued past implementation day, they are in direct violation of the JCPOA. And instead of excusing Iranian behavior, this is our opportunity to hold Iran's feet to the fire, because if they get away with this kind of incremental cheating on the deal, incremental cheating in some becomes egregious cheating, as the Iranians believe that they can continue to violate the agreement, violate the Security Council resolution, and face no consequences for that.
Okay, we're going to switch over to questions from the audience, and I'm just going to give the very first question from one of these that was submitted in advance, and it's directed, let me direct it to you, Eric, which is about whether there are any targeted sanctions that we can place on individuals and or organizations that provide material support to terrorist groups. And I want to combine that with my own question, because in your testimony last week, you talked about how the United States should think creatively about how to target unwinding of sanctions to achieve strategic goals. So maybe you could combine those two together.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good question, whoever was the person who submitted this one, because it's interesting. There are always more targets to focus on in the Iran context. There's constant intelligence coming in suggesting that, for example, new networks are engaged in proliferation of ballistic missile technology. New networks are engaged in supporting Hezbollah or in providing direct financing to Hezbollah. But actually what I think is almost more important in this context is not necessarily new target designations, even though I think there have only been 11 fairly weak ballistic missile designations since the JCPOA, no human rights designations, and I don't think there have been many, if any, terrorist-related designations. I think less important than potential designations is actually the enforcement posture that's being taken by the U.S. government. And so what you've seen, going to Mark's point, is that you've had many comments, particularly early in the process in August 2015, by the administration, that we will continue to adopt a rigorous enforcement posture for the enforcement of non-nuclear related sanctions that remain on Iran. And yet you've also had a significant reluctance, I think, on the part of Treasury to announce new enforcement actions, to continue to engage in deep dive investigations to reveal illicit conduct and punish entities engaged in that conduct. So, for example, financial institutions or companies that are sending goods or services to Iran. And so I think, and part of the reason I think the administration is doing this is quite consciously, they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to create a situation where Iran thinks that all of a sudden it's supposed to see these benefits, and then the administration is really sort of continuing to apply the pressure across a wide range of other topics. And as a result, I think that to a large extent, the lack of enforcement posture and the lack of aggressive enforcement has hamstrung the administration and also made it more difficult to convince foreign actors that Iran continues to be a very risky jurisdiction. And so less so, I think that more targeted sanctions are required. I think it's a more vigorous enforcement posture is probably what's required. The last thing I was going to say is, in terms of targeted unwinding, I think this goes directly to Mark's point earlier with the Boeing sale. Instead of just permitting these aircraft to be sold to Iran Air and then potentially misused, if you set up the process in such a way that you delivered the aircraft on a particular schedule and verified potentially beforehand that Iran Air was no longer engaging in prohibited or illicit activities, then I think you could be more certain that they were not sort of engaged in type of activities that you want to stop. But B, also, you could use the careful unwinding of sanctions to achieve a strategic goal, which in this case would be preventing Iran Air from continuing to support IRGC, continuing to support Hezbollah, continuing to support Syrian President Bashar al-Assad.
Were you going to add to that, Mark?
Well, just so it's a quick point. I mean, again, a presidential certification that none of these airlines are conducting illicit activities and therefore should have their sanctions lifted. I mean, once the sanctions are lifted on Iran's main airlines, then and the president can certify that the Iranian aviation industry is no longer conducting illicit activities, then you move forward with a sale. But to move forward with a sale while they're still sanctioned, while they're still conducting illicit activities.
Although Iran Air, as you said, is no longer designated.
But Iran Air is still conducting illicit activities, right, as of June. So, again, we need to hold.
And you've told the administration about these activities, but
sure.
What is the administration doing about those reports? Do they verify them?
Look, the administration is actually having a very tough time. Mahan Air is still designated, and Adam Zubin is flying around the world trying to convince Europeans and Asians and the Gulf to stop letting Mahan Air land at their airports. I mean, it's remarkable. This is IRGC Air, still under U.S. sanctions, still conducting flagrant illicit conduct, and flying into European and Asian and Gulf airports. And Adam is doing the best job he can trying to convince them to stop, but they're not.
Meaning the Undersecretary of Treasury for Terrorism Finance.
The acting who should be confirmed.
Right. So we should open it up to questions from live human beings in the room who haven't already submitted them. And if you could identify yourself before asking your question, that would be great. And mics are coming around.
Hi, Rachel Oswald, a reporter with Congressional Quarterly. My question is about the potential for the IRGC, because of what you're saying, that it's partly the IRGC's huge role in the Iranian economy and the many companies it owns that is keeping foreign banks leery of investing in the country. Is there a potential for domestic pressure to be brought to bear on the IRGC to divest itself of many of its business interests, to sell off its shares so that these businesses won't be toxic?
Interesting question.
So I think it's a great question, Rachel. And I think actually the IRGC is already doing that, but it's doing so in ways that are actually creating more compliance problems for financial institutions, not less. Because in selling off its shares and quote unquote divesting itself of companies and starting to walk back from its role in industries, what it's actually doing is it's creating fronts. It's setting up shadow companies and front companies, and it's actually putting their shares and their holdings in these shell companies so that from a bank's perspective, their counterparty looks clean. But when you trace that counterparty's connections 2 or 3 or 4 steps backwards, lo and behold, you discover that it's the IRGC that's actually still behind the transaction. So what you effectively need in Iran, which is an enormous transformation, is you need the Iranian private sector, private sector, actually pushing the IRGC out of the key strategic sectors of Iran's economy. They need to push them out of energy and construction and banking and automotive and aviation and shipping and you name it. So all the key strategic sectors that the Iranian IRGC has dominated, the private sector has to push them out, but really push them out, not just create a situation where they're just setting up hundreds of shadow companies and shadow holdings. And that is an enormous challenge for a private sector today that has that certainly does not have any political power, and even the Iranian state and Rouhani and Rafsanjani and others who are fighting the IRGC at many levels are themselves have been engaged, especially Rafsanjani over the years, in illicit activities that are longer than your arm. So that's the problem. There really is no real private sector today that can replace the IRGC, and until there is, I think Eric's right. I think the major financial institutions are going to be just loath to go back in and risk their reputations and the viability of their banks.
Can I also just chime in on that for 1 second? In addition to the layering that Mark is talking about, and I think he's exactly right on, from the U.S. perspective, from OFAC's guidance that's given to U.S. and foreign financial institutions, that's also been a particular point of frustration. In general, OFAC has provided a significant amount of guidance in the Iran case, but on this question of how much due diligence is necessary to make sure that, for example, you're not doing business with an IRGC-owned or controlled company, OFAC simply says whatever due diligence is sufficient. I mean, that's literally the legal language in the FAQ that they used, sufficient due diligence. And from a banking perspective, that doesn't really tell you very, very much at all. And so there's certainly been some frustration on the part of U.S. and Western financial institutions, and that in turn has led to them saying, well, then if we can't get guidance from what's enough from the U.S. government, and we know this layering is such an issue in Iran, we're just not going to go into the market in the first place.
All right, more questions? I saw a hand over here. Can you identify yourself? And there's a microphone coming over.
Hi, Rachel Wagley with Congresswoman Ann Wagner's office. I'm wondering if you can quickly talk about, you talked about minor, smaller European banks going into the country. Do you see any movement of goods or trade with the West that you could expand on and sort of describe the situation?
Sure. I mean, yeah, there are certainly transactions that are occurring with Western companies directly into Iran. But it's interesting because the nature of those goods and services take a very particular form. It's usually the shipment of manufactured products to Iran, or it's contracts that are structured in such a way that there's no sort of really significant capital investment into the country. And the reason why is fairly evident, right? So there's a risk of sanctions snapback. There's a risk of additional sanctions unrelated to snapback on things like ballistic missile proliferation and related terrorism support. And so, in particular, European nation companies are structuring the transactions and structuring the contracts in such a way that if sanctions are reimposed or additional sanctions are imposed, they can walk away without too much of a financial loss.
I know there's some embassy folks here. Would any of them like to have a shot at asking a question? No? Okay. Anyone else? Yes. Rafi, if you could identify yourself.
Thank you. I'm Rafi Danziger, consultant to APAC. I understand that the reason that Airbus also needs an American license is because of American parts in Airbus planes. The question is, could the administration decide to separate and grant a license to Airbus but not to Boeing, in which case actually Airbus might even take up the Boeing deal?
I don't. Eric could answer if that's technically possible. I mean, I think politically impossible. I mean, and you certainly, it was interesting over the weekend, you heard the, I think it was the head of Boeing's commercial division, making it very clear that if Boeing doesn't get a license, no one gets a license. So I think, again, politically difficult, and I think even technically probably hard to sustain, given the fact that there is at least more than 10%, right, of Airbus planes that have U.S. content. So if you're giving an Airbus license, it's hard to justify not giving a Boeing license. So that's what I would say.
I mean, on the legal point, that's absolutely right, Mark. Above 10% U.S. origin product in an Airbus plane, then you have... Airbus is subject to U.S. jurisdiction and has to apply for an OFAC-specific license, which they've done. On the technical legal point, OFAC could absolutely grant a license to Airbus and then not grant it to Boeing. Specific licenses are non-binding, which means they're not precedential, so they could absolutely do it. But politically, I think it would be a non-starter.
I just want to add that, despite these amendments that passed by voice vote in the House on Thursday night that would block the Boeing sale, isn't it also true President Barack Obama has pledged that he would veto any legislation that undermines the deal? And this, I know the administration sees this as a crucial part of the deal. They have said that there have been so many crashes by Iran, commercial aircraft with civilians in them, that this is almost like an extension of the humanitarian aspect with medicine and food, that it's a badly run commercial airline, civilian airline system that needs that, ordinary Iranian citizens need to be carried around in safe planes. So I think he's made pretty clear that he would veto that, correct?
Well, he certainly has made that clear, but actually that's just not true. Because here's the situation. So you've got the Iranian airline industry, which is absolutely corrupt, terrible safety record, dominated by the Revolutionary Guards. Then you've got a significant increase in Gulf Airlines and Turkish Airlines that have actually increased their capacity, I think up to about 40 to 50% of the entire aviation capacity of Iran, that are providing both domestic and foreign flights to Iranians. Now you've got British Airways, Alitalia, Lufthansa, and Air France that have all restarted flights to Iran. So you've actually got...
What about internal flights?
Well, no, both domestic and international are being served by other airlines. And so, in fact, if anything, if you really care about the safety of Iranian travelers, you should be encouraging safe, transparent foreign airlines from servicing the Iranian market and providing flights to Iranians rather than selling Boeing and Airbus planes to the Revolutionary Guards. Iranians have alternatives right now. They have safe, transparent, and secure ways to fly. And I think the notion of sort of giving these airlines that are all riddled with corruption and engaged in illicit activities, new Boeing and Airbus jets, I think is bad for U.S. security. And I don't think it necessarily, there is no humanitarian need that needs to be addressed. We don't want more bad Iranian airlines flying. It's just...
Are there restrictions, though, that exist? I mean, I can imagine that a flight might come from Britain, land in one major Iranian city, and go to another. But aren't there restrictions in every country over a foreign airline running the domestic routes? I don't know of any country where foreign airlines run all the domestic routes. Is that something that...
Virgin Airways, you can structure these deals all the way you want. I mean, Virgin is now running domestic routes in the United States, right? Virgin is a British airliner that only flew international transatlantic flights, and now you can fly from Washington to LA on Virgin American.
Louis. You know what I mean?
Well, no. The point is, is your question: is the Iranian government prepared to open up its aviation market so that foreign airlines can service domestic routes? The answer is probably no. But could they? The answer is absolutely yes. And so there really isn't an overwhelming humanitarian need to provide these aircraft unless you believe that it's in U.S. national security interest to help build up the Iranian aviation industry and have Revolutionary Guard controlled airlines or agents and affiliates of the Revolutionary Guards running domestic flights not only inside Iran but from IRGC resupply bases to Assad and Hezbollah.
Did you want to add something, Eric?
Yeah, I did. I'm sympathetic. Obviously, there's significant risks in providing these aircraft to Iran, and in particular to Iran Air. I'm also sympathetic to the safety concern, and that Iran Air has had a very dubious and, frankly, a terrible safety record for the past 20, 25 years. I think the way that this debate is moving is, and I know that this is the voice vote legislation, is that there's an attempt to find a way to pass or provide legislation that requires statutorily OFAC and the Treasury Department to allow a specific license to go through, but the specific license would be required to contain a large number of restrictions, some of the restrictions we were talking about earlier. So, for example, a presidential certification or some limit on the delivery of the aircraft until there is an understanding that Iran Air is no longer engaged in such activities, or escrow payments up front to ensure that if Iran does use these goods for illicit activities, then they'll forfeit all of the money that they paid for the plane. So I think that's where sort of the movement is, because there's an argument that we've seen, and our third witness last week brought this up, that a blanket statute or a blanket bill that broadly prohibits the sale of these aircraft to Iran may actually violate a provision of the JCPOA. It's an arguable point, but I think there's concern that it would. And so I think that what you're seeing is the movement is a little bit in the direction of trying to make sure that the legislation really clamps down on Iran's ability to use these aircraft for illicit purposes.
Okay. Any other questions? I saw his hand first, and I'll come to you.
Yeah, Tim Dykstra, Senate Appropriations, Energy and Water Subcommittee. So I'm curious that before and after the JCPOA, as I understand it, illicit missile and nuclear sales are believed to have occurred. And if after the sanctions have been lifted, the economy has rebounded, maybe not as much as Iran would like, but it's rebounded. Can you help me? It's a super basic question, but two parts. The first is, how is it that a richer Iran could be safer to us than a poorer Iran? And the second part is, what do you think should trigger reinitiation of those sanctions?
And one clarification, just because, and although I'm guilty of telling all of you to identify yourselves, and I didn't identify myself at the beginning, but I'm a journalist. I'm sorry. I'm Indira Lakshmanan. I'm a columnist for the Boston Globe and a contributor to Politico magazine. So just as the sort of neutral party here at the table, let me just translate that question to Mark by saying that the German reports that Mark was referring to detail activities in 2015 before and after the deal was agreed to. And they suggest, at least from what we've read, I don't read German, but from the reports on it in English that I have read, the intelligence agencies were saying we have no reason to think they have stopped, but I don't know that our own American intelligence agencies have verified that this is going on in 2016 since implementation day. That is what I have gotten from the U.S. administration, so I can impart that to you. I have asked immediately, as soon as those reports came out, picked up the phone and said, wait a second, is this going on since implementation day? And U.S. intelligence agencies have not verified that. And then over to you, Mark, for your larger question.
Well, that's right. So let me get to the larger question, which is, I mean, is a richer Iran better for U.S. national security than a poorer one? I mean, it really depends, right? I guess in some senses, yes. If it's a richer Iran where the wealth moderates Iran, where it moderates Iran's leadership, where it's a different Iranian regime in 8 to 10 years, right? Because in 8 to 10 years, in 8 years, the key restrictions on Iran's nuclear program start to go away. They accelerate after 10 years, and after 15 years, most of the restrictions are gone. So Iran ends up with an industrial-sized nuclear program with near zero nuclear breakout capability, a advanced-powered, clandestine centrifuge sneak-out capability, an ICBM, a missile program, a regional hegemony, a powerful economy, which is going to be increasingly immunized against our sanctions pressure, and a huge and well-armed military. So it better get rich, and it better get moderate, and it better get more responsible, or this deal is going to be a disaster. So the real question is, will it? And I guess that is the, I don't know if it's the $50 billion question or the $100 billion question, but it's a big question about whether whether economic seduction can moderate the hard men of Iran. Yeah. Can it turn them into pragmatic capitalists who no longer believe in exporting the Iranian Revolution, who no longer believe in supporting terrorism and building up an ICBM program, and most importantly, who no longer have aspirations for a nuclear weapon? Look, it better, because if it doesn't, the next president, or particularly the one after that, is going to face an enormous national security challenge. And we talked about due diligence nightmares. That's a national security nightmare. On the German procurement stuff, the Germans have provided enough hints in that report, and 2 German intelligence officials were interviewed by the Wall Street Journal who said this activity continues into 2016 past implementation day. Well, what is this activity? What exactly was happening? Was it on the nuclear side? Was it on the missile side? And again, to get to my point earlier, we are in this crazy situation today where if the Iranians violate the UN Security Council resolution that implements the deal, that's fine, as long as they're not violating anything that is inside the JCPOA, which is part of that implementation package. I mean, all of us have been involved in business deals in the past, or if you negotiated deals even when you bought a house. I mean, if you are paying your mortgage interest, so you're complying with the mortgage document that was part of your house closing, but you are engaging in activity that violates the property deed, right? Are you in violation of the entire real estate deal or not? I mean, remember, that's what I said. It depends on how you define this deal. And the administration wants to define this deal very, very narrowly because they are loath to hold Iran's feet to the fire on enforcement. And those of us who have deep concerns with this deal want to define the deal more broadly and say it has to include the implementation resolution of the UN Security Council for it to have any value. Otherwise, all Iran will do in very stark terms is it'll patiently wait on the fissile material side while it builds up its capability on the nuclear weapon delivery side. And then after 8 to 10 years, everything will come together. So now we'll have a deliverable nuclear weapon, because it'll have the missile, it'll have the warhead, and it'll have the fissile material. So if we take our eyes off the delivery mechanism, then we're playing right into Iran's strategy.
I would just like to add one point on that. From the U.S. side, we're viewing the deal very narrowly from the U.S. perspective. But we're then, at the same time, allowing the Iranians to construe the deal very broadly. And this goes to the idea of providing them with economic benefits that weren't really bargained for. So going back to the dollarized transaction issue, we were under no obligation to clarify to them that offshore dollar access was or was not prohibited under U.S. law. But we went ahead and did that so that foreign financial institutions could do dollarized transactions with Iran. So
But we haven't, the U.S. has not given them a license.
Haven't given them a license,
special.
but Adam Zubin, in testimony on May 24th, made it very clear that the United States does not view that it has jurisdiction over
The actual
offshore dollar.
greenbacks.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So it did give them the green light for the greenbacks, as Mark has written. And so from the U.S. perspective, we're viewing the deal as very broad, very narrow. But when viewing it from their perspective, we're giving them all the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, and I just add one other thing. I mean, there's opportunities here, right? No one is saying, let's tear up the deal.
No.
But the opportunity here is to say, all right, Iran, you forgot to negotiate certain concessions. You're not happy on the economic side. You want access to the U.S. dollar. You want FATF to get you off the blacklist. You want to get into the World Trade Organization, right? And when you're in the WTO, by the way, our ability to use financial sanctions against a WTO member will be severely constrained. Right, so Iran wants all of these benefits. Well, we still demand concessions from Iran on missiles, on terrorism, on the use of its aviation industry to support Assad and Lebanese Hezbollah, on its human rights abuses. Well, this would suggest that the next administration coming into office, because it won't be done by this one, has the opportunity and the predicate for a follow-on negotiation, for a subsequent agreement where you could now trade off all of the things that we want against all the things that Iran wants. And this is an opportunity for a follow-on negotiation. Unfortunately, if we spend the next 6 months, as we've spent the past 12 months, not calling the Iranians out on this illicit behavior and not using any sanctions to actually enforce our existing sanctions architecture, then all we're doing is reducing our negotiating leverage and making it much more difficult for the next administration to sit down and negotiate a fair and advantageous deal for the United States, if one is even forthcoming. That is the concern I have. I won't speak for Eric, but this is, again, we have an opportunity to address Iran's malign behavior, but in order to do so, we've got to enforce U.S. law, we've got to push back against Iran's malign activities, and we've got to set the next president up for a situation where she or he can negotiate a follow-on agreement that addresses many of the dangerous flaws of the current agreement.
All right, we're coming to a close of our time, so I'm going to take one last question. Sir, if you could identify yourself, please.
I'm Chris Bidwell from the Federation of American Scientists. Eric, Indira, Mark, thank you for some great presentations. My question is this. The Iran Sanctions Act may be expiring here in December, and it's possible that it could be renewed or not renewed. If it is or is not, what is the impact on the financial sanctions going forward from that point, if it's renewed or not renewed? And if you have any comments on the prospect for it being renewed, would like to comment on that. Thank you.
All right, who would like to start?
Mark, you want to? Or
Sure, go ahead, Eric.
So the question is likely to be renewed or not renewed, and then impact on financial sanctions. So I think that in terms of likely to be renewed, I'm not an expert on sort of the legislative politics around the ISA or ISA. My sense is that it will likely be renewed. I think there's enough support for it. I would be surprised if it wasn't. If it is renewed in terms of financial sanctions, I think that, let me rephrase that. If it's not renewed, I think that the impact on financial sanctions is going to be fairly significant. I will also say here, too, that what you've seen over the past 6 months to a year, and this is where it becomes important, is that in particular in congressional circles, Congress is being forced to a large extent to play much more of a tactical role in imposing sanctions on Iran and in sort of holding Iran's feet to the fire. So, for example, from 2010 to 2014, you had massive bills that came through, which were really important in increasing the pressure on Iran. So you had SASADA, you had NDAA, you had the Iran Threat Reduction Act, et cetera, right? But now you're in a situation where, with the JCPOA, these bills, which were really successful in putting pressure on Iran, are no longer sort of the MO. It's much smaller, but equally important, but smaller elements, such as, for example, trying to block Iran's access to offshore dollars or trying to block the elements of the Boeing and Airbus deal. And so I think that the ISA question will be important for determining, is Congress able to really sort of continue to apply the broad-based pressure, or is it moved much more to kind of a reactionary posture of trying to block whatever the most recent sort of administration attempt to provide Iran with some additional sanctions relief might be?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I would only add to this. So let's say Hillary Clinton's president. Secretary Clinton has been saying during the campaign very specifically that she's going to use strong financial sanctions against the Revolutionary Guards, against Iran's missile tests, and against other malign Iranian activities. I think if ISA is not reauthorized, that a President Clinton is going to find it exceedingly difficult to actually follow through on those campaign promises. Because not only will the failure to reauthorize ISA kind of vitiate key elements of statutory sanctions that remain on the books, but it will put a President Clinton in a situation where any attempt to impose sanctions, nuclear or non-nuclear, on Iran will be seen by the Iranians or played by the Iranians as a violation of the JCPOA. And then Iran will use what I've called their nuclear snapback, which to me is one of the most powerful elements of the JCPOA that doesn't get much attention, which is the provisions of the JCPOA that effectively say exactly that if the US, the Europeans, and others impose sanctions on Iran, nuclear or non-nuclear, Iran will treat the agreement as null and void. Now, what that means is that Iran then uses nuclear blackmail, which it's used over the past 3 years, I would argue, and says that if we walk away from this deal, we're going to snap back our nuclear program. And with that nuclear snapback, we're going to start to escalate our nuclear program. And then you, the United States and Europe and others, you're going to have no choice. Either you're going to have to use military force to stop us, or you're going to have to concede that we're on our way to having a nuclear weapon. They're using the nuclear snapback and the threat thereof in order to deter and in some respects paralyze our ability to create deterrence on both the nuclear enforcement side and on the non-nuclear side. And so what I fear this administration is doing, and though I would argue I think they're actually consciously doing this, and that is they are trying to lock in this deal in such a way that not only President Trump can't mess with it, but even a President Clinton can't actually follow through on her explicit commitments to push back and deter Iran's malign activities across the region. That presents a situation where we bet if that happens, then we literally we're creating a paradigm where unless billions of dollars don't economically seduce the hard men of Iran, Iran has got a clear pathway, multiple pathways, not only to nuclear weapons capability, but also to regional hegemony, a ICBM program, and regional dominance. And if that is the intent of the administration, to set that up in a paralyzed U.S.-Iran policy, all of this, dollar, FATF, WTO, John Kerry off on roadshows around the world trying to strong-arm U.S. bankers, all of that is going to set up a situation. European bankers, sorry, and U.S. bankers too now, with the Boeing deal. But all of that is going to create a situation where we are going to have no tools of coercive statecraft left, and an Iran policy that effectively is held hostage by an Iranian nuclear snapback.
All right. Well, we've been given the signal that time is up, so I want to thank you all for your attention, and please join me in thanking our speakers.